Hey, Ruben. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw my name box up here. Traverse City.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. We are starting. We are continuing a little bit of what we started last week, and we won't get through it all, of course. I'm just kind of filling in a little bit. I don't know who's taking over next week, but it won't be me. And so while I've been filling in for a couple of weeks, I kind of wanted to kind of just generally talk about the things that I've been studying in my schooling as they relate to the Bible, of course. And it's a unique approach in that we're kind of looking at the life of Moses, which we just recently went to the book of Exodus. We're looking at the life of Moses kind of through an English lit kind of view, an English literature kind of view. We're looking at it as it relates to modern storytelling and even ancient storytelling, right? And so just a little bit of review, if you weren't here last week, we kind of talked about, how do Moses and Luke Skywalker, what do they have in common? And it turns out they actually have a lot in common. There's this guy named Joseph Campbell who had this theory, wrote a book called Hero with 1,000 Faces, and his theory was that all these mythologies in ancient times, and even the narratives of today, follow a very similar pattern. Whenever you have this single protagonist or a group of protagonists, they go through this journey where they venture into the unknown, where they face dangerous forces, where they learn from their experiences, where they accomplish what they wanted, and then they return, right? Very simple narrative structure. And in his book, he was asking the question, why is it that all of these mythologies tend to be the same, right? And that's why he called it the mono-myth. That there's actually beneath all the different stories, there's a single story, a single tale, and part of what I'm studying is how this is an invention of God, how God had established this, why do you see all the different mythologies having very similar vibes, very similar elements, and his answer related to psychology, my answer relates to God. That when we are telling stories, what we are doing is we are abstracting from these truths that are inherent in our mind, these truths that are inherent in life, whether we've learned them or have inherited them in just the very nature of being made in the image of God. And so, how does this all relate to the Bible, right? And what we're trying to talk about is God decided what makes a hero. God decided what makes for how you grow. God decided what makes for someone who's worthy of admiration, worthy of note, what makes for a mission worthy of study, right? And when we take this approach to the Bible, what we're doing is we're looking at biographies of people. It's a kind of a character study, like with the person of Moses. How we look at the life of Moses and we might compare him to someone like Luke Skywalker. And that's just a for instance. That's just one that I feel like most everybody's going to know. But you could compare him to someone like Odysseus. You could compare him to someone like Hercules. You could compare him to someone like Pope Gregory the Great, who's got some really weird legends about him. You can compare him to Charlemagne. You can compare him to all these different people, but what we're doing is we're asking, how is Moses' story different than modern stories? How is Moses' story different than man-made stories? Because God tells the story better than the rest of us. And you find there are some very key similarities and very key differences. And like when we studied through the book of Exodus on our Wednesday nights, you may have not been totally focused on the character of Moses, and so you may have missed some things. Because there are parts in Exodus that are focused more on the plagues, focused more on Pharaoh, focused more on the Hebrews. But if you walk through it, focusing on a single character, if you read through it, focus on Moses, you're going to see some things come alive. You're going to see his growth, his strength, his weaknesses, you're going to see his trials, and it becomes a study of growth, a study of humanity, a study of how to overcome trials. And you compare Moses' life with a typical story, and you're going to see there's some similarities, but there are also some key differences, right? So he starts off, he tries to liberate the people on his own, but he doesn't do so well. And so what does he do? He flees. He flees, and God calls him. He's reluctant at first, but then he comes, he separates from his family, he separates from Midian, and then he meets Pharaoh. And then in the bulk of the story, you have that back and forth between Moses and Pharaoh, right? Where he is presenting the plagues. Sometimes Pharaoh says no, sometimes Pharaoh says yes, and then reneges. And sometimes, towards the end, what you have is the final plague, where God's kind of preparing the people. It finally happens, and finally Pharaoh says, go. They go, Pharaoh decides we're going to come back, and then they're at the Red Sea. They split the Red Sea. That's your big conflict moment, right? And then finally they're led into Israel. They have a couple of problems along the way as Moses is getting them from the Red Sea all the way to Mount Sinai. And it perfectly follows this kind of 3-act structure where you have the start, the middle, and the end. And of course, most stories have that, but Exodus is very well divided in that way. And so as you look at just the person of Moses, and you're asking, and you're trying to understand who he is, right? You start from the beginning. You have this birth and this upbringing. When you start off with Moses, you see difficult situation. Israel is enslaved by Egypt. The Pharaoh wants to kill the children. The midwives say, we're not going to do that. And so in the midst of this situation, you have Moses being brought forth by rebellious midwives. You have Moses' mother rebelling from Pharaoh, keeping the child. You have Moses' mother putting the child into the Nile River, and him being found by Pharaoh's daughter. Now, one of the defining characteristics of a hero, or a lot of the stories we watch, is like destiny, right? And we talked a little bit about this last week, about why is it that all the heroes that we read about, that we see, all the superheroes, all the characters in all our major novels, there are so many of them that come from broken pasts. There aren't many main characters that come from perfect backgrounds, perfect families, right? And we ask, why is that? Any of you guys have a thought?
Well, we're all sinners.
We're all sinners. Yeah, no, no one has perfect situations. Why is it that Batman, his backstory is that his parents died from a criminal? Why is that important?
Pushes him toward law enforcement.
It pushes him it kind of defines who he is a little bit, why he does the things he does. Kim, did you have something?
They overcome.
They overcome. Yes, it's something to overcome. Yeah, and here with Moses, right, I think the theme here is kind of destiny. That's what you would say in a kind of an English literature way, but for us Christians, what do we call destiny? We call it God's will, God's providence, right? And Luke Skywalker would be called the chosen one, whereas Moses himself, all these unique coincidences fall in line to make him the ideal candidate to carry out God's mission. And so if you're approaching this kind of like a storyteller, a novel, if you're approaching this as we're trying to figure out who Moses is, we got to establish where does he come from? And then we establish, okay, who is he? When we open up, who is he? Well, he was raised by the Egyptians. He was royalty, meaning he had the best education you could get at the time. He was familiar with Egyptian policies. He was familiar with the Egyptian courts. He was very likely a judge in Egyptian courts. I believe that. He was definitely a prince, and yet at the same time he felt compassion for his Hebrew brethren who were slaves. And so just some scriptures kind of filling out who Moses is at this moment. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Right? So he had really good education. Exodus 2:11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And so we kind of talked a little bit about this. Why is Moses so concerned about the slaves, right? I mean, this is his people, but he didn't have to be so concerned about them. And we talked a little bit about, him growing up as a prince of Egypt, and yet he was not Egyptian, probably made him feel out of place in his own home. And that probably made him want to connect with his people. And the fact that he is royalty and rich, and he doesn't need to be concerned about the slaves, and yet he still went out to look at them. And what does that mean? That means he cares about them. And we're kind of rounding out who he is. He's got a great education. He cares about these people. He knows the politics. He knows the court systems. He probably knows Pharaoh himself, right? Hebrews rounds out the picture a little bit more. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So we're kind of rounding out who is Moses. This is our starting point. Because the Moses by the end of Exodus is going to be very different, right? He's going to go through a lot. But here we have Moses, who has great knowledge, great ability, compassion, resolve, and it seems like faith from this verse. And then we start going through Exodus and we start looking at his journey, just kind of an overall picture. And I threw Luke Skywalker up here, right? And she's like, okay, how does Luke Skywalker start out, right? You got that call to adventure. Luke gets this message, save me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. And Obi-Wan says, you're going to come with me to Alderaan. And he says, well, no. And then his home is destroyed. And then finally he goes. And then Obi-Wan wants to teach him the Force. He's got this cool lightsaber and he's going to have to train. What do? They go to the place Mos Eisley in that cantina. He's out of his familiarity. He's out of the known. He's going into the unknown. And then they get together with Han Solo, Chewbacca. They try to go to that planet, find out the planet's not there, and then they get captured. That's the first act of Star Wars: A New Hope. And so when we compare that to Moses, you have some very similarities, a lot of similarities. Moses, he's convicted. He doesn't need to hear the, save me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. He sees people in need of help, right? And what Moses does is he doesn't wait for the mentor. He doesn't wait for the supernatural power. Instead, he decides, I'm going to go do something right now. And he kills an Egyptian soldier. And then he goes to the Hebrew people and he's trying to help them. And the Hebrew people look at him and say, what, you're going to do something to us? You just killed a guy the other day. And then Moses realizes the Hebrew people aren't going to receive his help at all. And so what does he do? He runs away. He finds himself in the middle of the desert in Midian. He finds himself a foreigner, finds himself a new home. Right? And so this is kind of his first try. Whenever you have that character and you have that first act, Moses kind of has two first acts. In that he has this first act where he tries to accomplish a mission and fails. And then the second time he's going to try the mission again. Let's go ahead and just kind of breeze through these real fast. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. That's one of that defining moments where there's no returning. He's like, I'm going to do this right now. Well, it doesn't go that great, right? He went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And so this is one of those moments where it seems like he thought an army was going to rally behind him. He thought the Hebrew people were going to think, finally, a leader for us. And then Moses realizes they don't see you as a leader, right? And then he runs away. Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And this is one of those moments where it's kind of like all hope is lost What's he going to do? He's in the middle of nowhere, and yet God helps him. Now, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their flocks. And we remember that he saves them because some people were harassing them. But getting to it, verse 21, Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter, Zipporah. So that's kind of Moses' first act. And Moses, when we first see him, right, he's a man with a plan. He acted courageously in wanting to stand up. He was a little bit too brash in that he killed a guy, but he's a guy who's courageous, right? He's willing to stand up for people. He cares. He knows a lot, but he had his own call. He's like, I'm going to do this. He's a man with a plan. I think we mentioned it last week. He thought he had an idea and he was going to accomplish it. And I don't know if he thought, oh, I'm going to do this for God, or God's going to be on my side, or God's going to help me whenever I start doing this. But he expected everyone else to fall in line, and that's not what happens. And so his journey that he tried to start himself, it's going to have to wait 40 years when the Lord's going to give him the call. Not when he's 40, when he's 80. And that time, when God does call him, it won't be his plan. It won't be his idea. It won't be his power and strength. It won't be with violence. And so, one of the things in this theory of of these mythologies and these ideas is there's this cycle of creation and destruction. And I think this is exactly how God operates. He creates, he destroys, right? That's the whole Ecclesiastes 3, there's a time to reap, a time to sow, right? A time to kill, a time to give birth, or something along those lines. And so in these stories, just in life, there is death and rebirth, creation and destruction, right? Destruction of the old, creation of the new. What you find in the story already, Pharaoh was trying to kill all the Hebrew children. And what do we see instead? We see Moses' mother creating this beautiful boy and trying to preserve it. When we see Moses' home in Egypt was destroyed, and he had to create for himself a new home in Midian. You see, Moses' arrogance was destroyed, and he was reborn humble. Through the story of Exodus, he has this timidity that he's going to come to God and say, God, I can't do this. Please don't make me do this. God, why am I doing this? And we're going to see that destroyed through the trials, and out comes his faith. We're going to see Pharaoh, and he has this stubbornness and this authority and this power, and he's saying, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do. And over the plagues, God is going to slowly chip away at it until that stubbornness is broken down to where finally Pharaoh submits. Right? And overall, you have the people of Israel. They're enslaved. He's going to destroy that slavery and create for them liberty. Right? So there's this creation and destruction, and creation and destruction. And really, that's just kind of how life works. Right? Any thoughts, comments so far? Okay. Most of that was review. We can slow down a little bit now. So, this is Moses' new start. You had that first trial where he decided, I'm going to liberate the Hebrews on my own. Well, now he's going to get called. This is his new starting point. Exodus 3:1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So, 40 years has passed. He is now a humble shepherd in a foreign land. Moses knew a lot before all this happened, before he became a shepherd. What do you think he has learned so far? In the 40 years that he was in the desert being a shepherd, what do you think he learned from being a shepherd that he wouldn't have learned in his Egyptian schooling? Would he have learned anything? Kim?
He had to learn how to be a leader for these sheep.
A leader for the sheep.
And to care for these sheep.
To care for these sheep. I mean, doesn't that sound like a step down, though? I mean, he had to learn how to be a leader of Egypt because he was a prince and judge. What's the difference? What does it mean to be a leader of sheep? What?
There's not that much difference.
Not that much difference.
No, I mean, yeah. And, Jesus said, we were the sheep, and he was the gate for the sheep. He's the shepherd. And so
Right.
Jesus took that same role.
Jesus, that same role. God really loves shepherds. I mean, all throughout the Bible. Shepherd, shepherd, shepherd. Wanda?
I think one of the things he might have learned was humility, because he's doing a menial task, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
taking care of sheep. He's no longer the prince of Egypt, so he got knocked down a peg or two.
Oh, yeah. It is more menial. I mean, how would you like to go from an executive in the company to the mailman, right? Working in the mailroom. I mean, I know God loves shepherds, but that's a very common, everyday job. The kind of job where we would think, oh, anybody can do that. I'm not saying anybody can do that, but I'm saying we don't think much of it, right? And maybe Moses, I mean, he did have to learn humility. And while there are some major similarities, okay, so we got some elders in here. What's the difference between being an elder and working in the business world? Are you guys going to be honest enough to answer it? I see 4 elders. You guys want to chime in? Brett?
Well, in the business world, typically as an executive, you have to figure out a plan to make your company money.
Mm-hmm.
And if that means that certain people follow and certain people don't follow, then you have to get rid of the people that don't follow.
You got to get rid of the people who don't follow. Your goal is to make money. Those are big differences. Bob, did you have something?
Yeah, I see a lot of similarities in some ways because with the church, you have to stay organized. You got to have some kind of a goal or a plan. You have to decide what are we going to do. There's a lot of similarities, objectives. You try to hope that everybody has a way to contribute to the success. Same thing as in a corporation.
Yeah. Organization,
The difference
vision.
is, I think the church is going to have better morals.
Better morals. Yeah, the church will have better morals than the business. You hope so, right? Clint?
I think accountability would be for me because the elders are accountable to the members, to the God. In a business realm, you're accountable to your supervisor or CEO or whoever.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, and you said in the business you're accountable to really the people above you, whereas as a shepherd, you're kind of accountable to the people below you and to God himself, right? And I bring that up because I think there are some really good parallels here in that being a shepherd, it's a lot more hands-on, I would say, for sure. For Moses, a shepherd had to know every single person in his flock, right? He had to know how many was in his flock at all times, right? Because if he's missing one, that's on him, right? That's his job. That's literally his job. And so he needs to be able to count, okay, I have 47 here, and about every hour he probably needs to do a recount. Okay, we're one short, got to go find him, right? Or, a shepherd, they're going to start learning their personalities. You're with them 24/7. You're just going to start realize, that's little Billy. He likes to wander off. I got to smack him a little bit. You know what I mean? And with sheep, like in the business world, like Brett said, they don't follow along. You just got to get rid of them. But whenever you have a flock, you can't just get rid of one of them. These are your livelihood. And there's care, and there is, whenever they get injured, you care about that. If they get injured and they can't walk, you're carrying them, it's just, Moses, I feel like this is a much more menial work, but I feel like this is very good preparation for what's going to happen in the future when he's leading Israel, isn't it? Kim?
Well, and the shepherd, he has to protect the sheep too, like from wolves and whatever else.
Yeah, he has to protect them. There is still some need for that strength and courage that he has, but I feel like here he's having to learn patience, gentleness, persistence, right? And I feel like that's something that maybe he's learning for the first time in his life, And that's what you need as a leader in God's people, right? That's what God wants as a leader. And so we're kind of forming who is Moses now, right? So he's 80 years old, right? And that just kind of blows my mind. You know, in the Hebrews' minds, the average end of life was 70, unless you got sick, right? And so he is beyond the typical age. He's at that age where in these days they're like, you don't have much longer. And that's when God calls him, crazy enough. He's living as a foreigner. He doesn't belong in the land he is in. He's got a wife and kids. He seems to be a little bit more timid by how he responds to God. I think he's developed some more patience and persistence. He's not really faithful to God at this time. We'll see later on that he has a son who is not circumcised, right? And so here, Moses is in this ordinary world, and he's going to have to go beyond. He's going to have to be called out of this world, right? This is his starting place. And it's really unique because in mythologies and fables and in stories and all those ancient tales, it was really common to have the hero have a period of exile when they were young. And they would go off for some reason, whether it was their parents' fault or whether they got lost or something like that, and they would go and be exiled, and then a decade later they would come back and usually be a strapping young man ready for the journey. Moses is 80. He comes back, and you're like, he's going to go on the adventure? You know? When most people would have written him off, God called him. And it makes me, and at this point, we should be asking ourselves, okay, this was Moses' starting point. What was my starting point? Where did I begin? How have I grown spiritually? You know, Moses, he had that rough upbringing. He had some rough troubles. And then he's just kind of, I can't imagine he's excited to be where he is. I mean, maybe he's come to be content with it. 40 years, I mean, sure, he's probably content with it. But he probably carries a lot of that baggage from failing. What about us? You know, where were you before you came to Christ? How different are you now as compared to where you started, whether your start was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago? How have you grown? And that's an important question to ask. As we go through Exodus, we're going to see Moses grow a whole lot. But before you see that growth, you got to see where he started. Any thoughts, comments? Okay. So he has that moment where he meets the mentor, right? Where a lot of the times in stories, you'll have this fairy godmother. With Luke Skywalker, this is where he meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, someone who's experienced, someone who's got wisdom, someone who's got something to pass on to him like a lightsaber or the power of the Force. And this is Moses. He's going to meet his mentor, God. And God is going to instruct him on nearly every step he takes throughout Exodus. And in this narrative, and this is one of the biggest differences between Hollywood movies and the story of Moses. Moses really isn't the main character. It's God, right? I mean, when Moses makes a decision, it's usually because God told him to. And all the heroes in the Bible, they do really well whenever they don't do what they want to do and they do what God wants them to do. And in that way, God is the one who's really, I mean, you say God's the mentor, but really, Moses is the vessel. But God's going to provide him some guidance. He's going to enable him. He's going to help him. And only through God's protection is Moses going to be able to accomplish this. Because remember, the entire Exodus, not a single person shed blood, right? The entire Exodus, this revolution where they liberated all the slaves, not a single person had to fight to do it. God did all of the fighting. And so Moses is praised, not because of his strength, not because of his cunning, not because he vanquished the dragon, not because he tricks the Cyclops. He is a hero because he obeyed. That's what God values. So let's walk through that. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. You know, in your life, have you had some mentors? You know, when we're thinking of like people like Obi-Wan Kenobi, when we're thinking of people like just your fairy godmother, when we're thinking of God filling this role of being your mentor who gives you the power, who gives you the knowledge, the know-how of how to accomplish things, what does it mean to look at God like your mentor? Would that change any way that you look at him? Right? What would it mean for God to be your mentor? What is a mentor? Any thoughts? Okay. You're good. Yeah.
Well, to me, it's just somebody that's going to give you guidance and try to tell you the best way to do things.
I think someone who gives you guidance. Is that very different than how we view him already? Probably not, right? And I'm not looking for a specific answer. I'm just kind of trying to generate some thinking here. Right, Clint?
Somebody that has greater experience and knowledge that they can pass on.
Someone with greater knowledge and experience that can pass on to you. You know, is that how we view God? Right? Do we view God as someone who knows better? Someone who has this knowledge to pass on, that whenever you take that knowledge, you get to, I have a mentor personally, and, you know, he's been a preacher for 40 years. And so whenever he tells me something, I listen very closely. And because he's been through it, he's been doing this longer than I have. And I've learned that the more I just do what he says, the more I escape trouble. Right? Sometimes I've had to learn the hard way. I'm like, that doesn't sound right. And I found out, he was right. Right? And I feel like that's how God is. Like, when you just do what he says, you find out, wow, that worked out better. Right? And he doesn't want you to have to learn the hard way. Let's be honest, sometimes we got to learn the hard way. And sometimes we don't even learn the hard way. Just go through the hard way and we don't learn. But when you listen to God and you find out, he knew what he was talking about. Right? So Moses here, he's called. Verse 9, this is God saying, And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptian oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And so that's that moment where finally he is called. Where now we have a purpose, and now the purpose has come to his ears, and now he knows that he's going to have to do this. Now, usually how the story goes is usually you're a little hesitant at first, and sure, that's what that's what Moses does here. This is, and then sometimes you come across this, however you may want to come across this, but the hero hears the calling, and it's that pivotal moment in his biography where things are going to change once he listens. And so we see Moses, he is called through an unusual sight. He is called onto holy ground. God sees the people's troubles and wants to rescue them. God wants to punish the Egyptians, and he said, Moses, you're going to lead it. This is just like Obi-Wan said, Luke, you're going to have to come with me, and you're going to have to learn the Force. And then Luke was like, no, I'm not going to do that, right? More on what God said. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Again, Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God just says, this is why I'm calling you, and you're the person who's going to do it. And I wanted to kind of stop for a second and look at the burning bush. You know, for those of you who remember your English lit classes, you'd have a question on an essay question of, what does the burning bush represent in the story of Moses, right? And so let's kind of ask ourselves that. You know, God could have presented him in any specific way, but he chose a burning bush. Was it just to get Moses' attention? Is it just because it was a convenient way? Or did God have some more meaning to this? I don't know. Whenever I ask, does it symbolize something, and what does it symbolize? What do you think of?
God is represented in fire on Sinai. He's in the Bible, it's talked about him being consuming fire. So he's using that fire all along and healing himself.
Yeah, God calls himself a consuming fire. There are many times when God is represented by fire. Absolutely. Clint?
I guess looking ahead, that's when he's leading the Israelites by day, it's by a pillar of fire, right? So, sorry, vice versa.
Yeah.
So yeah, he uses a pillar of fire there to
When God is guiding the people of Israel out once they're out of Egypt, he guides them at night by a pillar of fire. Absolutely. Yeah, Cindy?
Normally a bush would burn up.
Mm-hmm.
This one doesn't, so it kind of shows to me God's power.
Yep. Normally the bush would burn up, but this one isn't, and so that shows God's power. Yeah. You know, just thinking of, you know, what could it be? So we have, of course, God is appearing through the fire. The angel of the Lord speaks through the fire. God speaks through the fire. You know, and you just look at fire, what does it represent throughout the Bible? There are a lot of times when it represents God himself, like Judy said. Sometimes it represents his wrath. Sometimes it represents not good things, persecution, and a lot of the times it's a thing of purification, where it may be something difficult, but it brings about something good. What does a bush represent, right? There are lots of instances in the Old Testament when a vine or a tree represented the people of Israel, right? And I think that's probably a really good connection here. I also thought, what if this represents Moses himself? And of course, we know later on Jesus is going to say, I'm the true vine. Right? I don't think this is referencing Jesus. I think Jesus may have referenced this. But there are a couple of different interpretations. I think the one that I like the most is the idea that God's people are sustained. Like Cindy said, even when it's on fire, it's not being consumed. Right? Or like Judy says, that God is right there. It reminds me of a Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they were in the fire, God was there with them, right? It reminds me of, just thinking of the story of Moses, how he's going to go through some difficult things, or maybe even the people of Israel are going to go through some very difficult things, but God's always going to protect them to make sure that they're taken care of. And it's like that creation-destruction cycle I talked about. Fire's supposed to destroy, but God is keeping it from being destroyed. And so it's like, even though I'm on fire right now, I'm perfectly fine. Even though I'm going through very difficult times, God sustains me. I don't know, that's the interpretation that I kind of like, that even when I'm in the midst of the fire, I'm perfectly fine. Why? Because God's right there with me in the fire. Just some thoughts. I don't know if there's a right answer here. Okay? So, refusal of the call. God's going to be so patient with Moses here. You know, this call that Moses gets, he says, I want you to rescue the children of Israel. You know, that's exactly what I think he was trying to do when he was 40, right? And so God comes along and he's like, hey, that thing that you tried to do but failed, I'm going to help you do it this time. And you'd think, oh, Moses would say, oh, you're on, oh, okay, we can get it done now. But 40 years have passed, and he's like, yeah, I don't want to do that. You know, that was probably the biggest failure of his life, and he's probably thinking, I have to go back to all of that? What if they try to kill me again? What if the Hebrews don't want to listen to me again? He's like, I'm 80 years old. I want to retire right now. And God says, no. You see, that impulsiveness and that violence, hopefully he has been shed of that. And 40 years later, Moses is not going to be the same. Hopefully, he's lost a lot of that brash confidence, but now he's just a little bit too timid. Right? When he was 40, he was too arrogant. And he's 80, and now he's just a little too timid. He feels unworthy, unable to accomplish the task. And we know that because of how he responds to God. 5 times Moses is going to respond, right? And you could say each one of them is kind of a hesitation or rejection, but he responds 5 times. So God says, I'm going to call you. And he's like, who, me? I don't think I'm qualified. And the second time, Moses says, well, I don't know what I'm going to say, right? Like, who did I say? And then God says, well, this is who I am. I am that I am. And then Moses said, well, what if they don't believe me? And God says, okay, here are some miracles. And then Moses, I think around the third one, Moses is starting to get a little, I guess, annoying, a little obstinate, right? Where he's not, it doesn't sound like to me, it doesn't sound like he's asking general questions about what do I say. He's starting to say, I can't do it. I think he starts complaining here. His questions start becoming complaining, where he says, I'm not able to speak well, which that isn't true. And then God said, I'm going to help you. And then with all the complaints he had out of him, he just says, can you send someone else? And it's at that point that God gets mad at him. He says, listen, you're going. I'll give you your brother, but you are going. And so God is pushing Moses out of his comfort. He is calling him to deny his own desire. And isn't that what we do in the New Testament, right? To deny ourselves and pick up our cross daily. And so Moses here, he has to deny himself. Even though he's being told to do something which he does not want to do, God says, you're still going to do it. I mean, go ahead, Bob.
These are probably the same excuses we give when we're put in a situation today that God wants us to do something we're not comfortable with, we haven't done before, that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
I can go through the same 5 answers myself.
Mm-hmm. Great thought. These are the same things that we might say to God about the things he asked us to do. I mean, God says, you got to love your enemy. And you say, I'm not sure I can do that. Well, I mean, what do I say to my enemy? Well, what if they don't believe that I'm trying to be genuine towards them? Well, I'm just not really good at that kind of stuff. Well, maybe someone else can do it, right? I mean, you're absolutely right, Bob. That's a really good list to just go through and ask yourself, are you making excuses whenever God asks you to do something, right? Because at the end of the day, Moses' first test really is having to accept the call itself. Right? And that's how it is just being a Christian. Your first test is being willing to obey God. Being willing to say, this is what God asked me to do, I have to do it. Right? So let's just kind of walk through these a little bit. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So Moses is like, but who am I? Right? Who am I? I mean, you were the prince of Egypt. I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you are a shepherd now. But when God calls you, you're someone special. It doesn't matter about who am I, right? Verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. I mean, this is kind of a good question. And he's saying, okay, what am I supposed to say? Maybe he shouldn't have needed to ask this question because God already said, hey, I'm the God of Abraham, I'm the God of Isaac, I'm the God of Jacob. You could have just said that. But Moses said, what do I say, right? Verse 15, God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. So he says it again. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. And then Moses comes back and he says, well, what if they don't believe me? Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. And notice here, Moses isn't even really asking. He's like, what do I do if they don't believe me? He's saying, they're not going to believe me. I mean, I feel like that's a little brazen to say to God. He's not even saying, God, what if they don't believe me? What do I do then? He's like, God, just so you know, I know you know everything, but just so you know, they're not going to believe me. Have you thought of that, God? Again, he's not thinking here. The Lord said to him, what's in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. And so he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. And the Lord said to him, put out your hand, catch it by the tail. And at that point, I'm saying no, but Moses put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. And then, second to last one, Moses said, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. And remember, he got the best education in Egypt, so this is probably not true. The Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I'll be with your mouth and teach you what you will speak. And then the last one, and this is just where God said, I've had it. He said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that you can speak well. See, he calls him on that. It's like, I know you can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. Oh, wait, no, he's talking about Aaron, my bad. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. So a lot of the times in your modern narratives and in your ancient narratives, you have the hero, and he's called, and he's like, here's this huge grand mission. Will you accept it? And a lot of the times in the movies and in all the mythologies and all the stories and the fables, they're reluctant at first. Moses, no exception. Maybe he's a little bit more reluctant than most. I mean, because he complains 5 times, right? I don't know. When you read this, what are you thinking about Moses? What's coming to your mind?
He doesn't want to do it.
He just doesn't want to do it. Yeah. Judy?
He's been there, done that.
He's been there, done that.
I've had that problem, trying to do something I couldn't, and then I can't.
Yeah. Try to do something and you can't.
Overcome difficulties when you know you failed before. What makes me think that
That's a good thought. He's saying, I already tried that and I failed, and he's thinking, it's impossible now. That's a good thought. Larry?
I don't know, it just comes to my mind, you'd think he would be, when he threw the staff on the ground, and it was a serpent that he picked, you'd think oh boy, I'm going to have some fun with Pharaoh now.
Yeah.
Wait to get there, but he doesn't.
Right. I mean, he just turned his staff into a snake. Yeah. He's thinking, oh, Pharaoh will believe that. If that happened to me, I don't think I would have the ability to say anything else. I would probably be silent from that. Ruben, you have something?
Yeah, I've always thought of Moses as just being human.
Mm-hmm.
Because typical guys, I know I was kind of this way. When I was young, I was bulletproof.
Mm-hmm.
You ask me to do something, I said, okay.
Right.
But now I give you all kind of excuses why I can't do that anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, when you're young, you feel bulletproof, right? But once you get older, you're starting to accept your limitations a little bit more. Oh, that totally makes sense to me. That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, Clint?
Just kind of popped into my mind, thinking of Matthew 28, where Jesus tells us to go and preach the gospel. In my mind, I can come up with those almost identical rebuttals that Moses came up with when God asked him to lead the people of Israel.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat of a parallel. And before, when I read this, I've always thought, how could you refute God 5 times?
Yeah.
But now I look and what Bob said, I already have.
Yeah.
I mean, because I made times if I said, oh, I don't know if I can talk to them,
Right.
you know, and that's a common thing for a lot of people. So I see a little bit of a parallel
Yeah.
in those two.
That's a great thought. Yeah. I mean, how can you rebuttal God 5 times in a row? And you're like, well, we already have. I mean, even though we're not speaking to God through a burning bush, but when you know God's commands and you're trying to make excuses, you're having that same conversation with God. That's a great thought. Laurel?
You know how powerful Pharaoh was. Oh my Lord, please send someone else. He just sounds weird.
That's a good thought. He sounds scared. Oh my Lord, please send someone else. I mean, at this time in history, I think Egypt's probably the biggest country. It's the U.S. of the day, and I mean, it's the Rome of the day. That's a better comparison. Where it's just the biggest country. Pharaoh's probably the most powerful man on the planet, and you're like, I'm going to convince this guy. I mean, you're right. He's a little scared. I like that thought. And so part of what this study was supposed to do is just kind of examining the character of Moses. And so as we go through it, we're just trying to learn about who Moses is, and so we can reflect a little bit upon who we are. And I know we went through Exodus on its own, but when you go through the stories with a different approach, sometimes it helps you see things that you hadn't seen before. And that was kind of the purpose of applying this. What about Luke Skywalker? What about modern stories today? And looking at it through that lens. If you like it, we can find another time whenever I can actually go through it more fully. And we don't even have to do Moses. Maybe someone like David, Peter, or Paul. If you like it, let me know. But I just had to fill in a couple of classes, and that's kind of what I was honestly 2 birds, 1 stone. This is what I'm studying anyway. Any final thoughts? Okay. I will hand it over to Bob.
Well, good evening. I'll go through a few announcements here. Let's see. The funeral for Joe Bradburn, the brother of Myron DeWitt and Larry Bradburn, will be tomorrow, and visitation is from 11:30 to 1:30, with the funeral services at 1:30. I don't have the location listed. Where's it at? Ellers? On Webster and South Webster, okay. Let's see, we also, okay, yeah, there'll be a luncheon here back at the church building, so we need people some men hopefully willing to help set up tables. We need, about 10 tables or so, I think?
Yeah, 10 or 12 tables.
Okay, and some chairs with it, but. Tonight. Yeah, that'd be tonight if you can do that after closing prayer, so, okay. Vacation Bible School will start June 23rd. That's next Saturday, June 1st. We'll have a planning meeting at 10 o'clock. And the meeting will be in room 100 on the east end of the building. So if you can participate in that, it'd be appreciated. And let's see. There's still meal planning for Kathy Sherrill and Sibani Peterson if you would like to participate in that. We have graduation open houses. Ella Purcell will be June 1st from 1 to 3 here at the church building. And Emma Purcell, Emma Watson, hers will be June 8th from 4 to 7 p.m. That's at 429 Northwest Street in Tipton. And does anybody have anything else? Did I miss anything? Okay, yes.
I've got a cat tomorrow.
You have a cat? Okay. A what?
Cardiac.
A cardiac cat. Tomorrow? Okay, we need to remember you in our prayers then. So, Randy, you've got closing prayer.
Please pray with me. Our gracious Father in heaven, as we come before you this evening, before your throne of grace, we want to praise your name. We want to thank you for your word that you've given us, that we may have the privilege of knowing you and your Son and all the many things that were planned for man's salvation from the foundation of the world. Father, at this time, we have many on our sick list, many who need help from doctors, help from family members, help from ourselves. We'd ask that you would be with them, Father. We'd ask, Father, that you would deliver them from their afflictions. We'd ask that you would bring them back to be with us as soon as possible. We'd especially, Father, like to pray for Denny, who will be having a heart catheterization tomorrow. We want you to be with the doctors and the nurses who care for them, help them to do their job in the best ways possible to bring about Denny's full recovery from this procedure. Father, we'd ask that you would be with the young people who are graduating from high school. Please, Father, help them to find ways to serve you as they move on, perhaps with their education, perhaps with jobs and professions. Father, we'd ask that you'd be with each one of us here. Help us, Father, to apply your word to our lives. Help us, Father, to take up our crosses daily and follow you. Be with this whole congregation, Father. Please bring us all back together on Sunday that we may do service to you and to each other. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen.